My friend is just messaging me saying, "You broke the cardinal rule of Zoom. You're not supposed to wear white on Zoom, apparently." With friends like this. Uh, Jesus.
Sorry, I wasn't aware of such a rule.
I didn't know you couldn't wear white. I'm like, yeah. Uh,
Does
friends,
it
friends, friends.
interfere with things that you have to say?
I don't know. Oh, no, no, no. My friend's like, oh, she's, yeah. Apparently, there is a line in Kala that says black is the color of the proletariat and white
Yes. I see, I see. Now I get the context.
black, not white.
Now I get the context. Good evening, everyone. This is just backstage banter that we are all having fun with. Thank you for joining us for sadly the last of the series. I wish we could have gone on and on, Suchitra, but hopefully we'll do something else soon.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today, this evening in India, which is going through a very, very, very rough time right now. And I hope everybody who's joined us, you are safe wherever you are. We're just going to give about 2, 3 minutes for everybody to join in, and then we will start our conversation today. It's also really lovely to see some names and some people who we know personally and other people who perhaps we don't, but they've been attending each of these series. So thank you so much for being with us. So nice to see you back again. Priya, I will wait for you to give me the green signal when we should start.
I think I can just start now. Yeah.
Start?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Great. Uh, Good evening, everyone, once again, and really thank you for joining us today for the last of the four-part series with Suchitra Vijayan and Polis Project. We've been having some fantastic conversations this month, all about reflections and all about reflections on representation. Uh, these conversations came about, from Suchitra's recently published book, Midnight's Borders: A People's History of Modern India, which is used as the point of departure to return to these fundamental questions on representation. And today we have with us Rishi Singhal. Rishi, welcome. Rishi leads the master's program in photography design at the National Institute of Design at Gandhinagar. And today he will be in conversation with Suchitra, reflecting on teaching photography and visual practice to a new generation of artists and practitioners who are committed to producing and creating socially relevant bodies of work. So, thank you for making the time, and over to both of you. I would also, just before I hand over, I would like to really thank Vasant, who's here with us, and Photo South Asia for making all these conversations possible. It's been very enriching and really, really important conversations to have at this point of time. So, thank you so much, Vasant and Photo South Asia. Uh, this is also something that we at the Chennai Photo Biennale Foundation and at the CPB Learning Lab that we do very regularly. So stay tuned with us going forward, and there will be lots more coming up. So today we begin with Suchitra and Rishi. Thanks, guys. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Suchi. Thank you, Priya. Thank you for the Chennai Photo Biennale for bringing all of us together. Thanks to Vasant for making this possible. Um, I want to start by acknowledging what's happening in India today. It's not an easy moment. It's a moment of great devastation and crisis. And one of the questions that has always plagued us, and there's a conversation that Suchi and I had as well, is that how does one respond to these moments in a way that is meaningful but also empathetic? And the only way we thought this was possible was to make these conversations not only as a response to the work that these remarkable guests have done, but also as a reflection of the present. So I'm absolutely thrilled today to be in conversation with Rishi. There's another conversation that's another. I just want to start with a little bit of an anecdote that kind of sets this whole conversation. Is that almost a year ago, January of last year, is when I first met Rishi. Again, thanks to Vasant, when Vasant had gotten many of us who've been thinking about photography as practitioners, as photographers, as archivists together in Delhi for a conversation. And our first conversation with Rishi happened the night after the JNU violence, where we were again having in grappling. That was another moment of crisis of the Republic that we all so dearly care about. And I still remember Rishi very, one thing I did remember walking away from that conversation was Rishi so passionately and eloquently advocating for his students and ways in which he could help his students. His biggest concern was how do I enable my students to do this work. I don't know if he remembers, but that was one of the things that I really took away from our conversation. He spoke about this little magazine that the students do about dissent, and that's always been on the back of my mind. So, almost a year from now, we are now here having this conversation, not only about reflections of representation, but what it means to teach photography, visual practice. So, what I'm going to do is, as I said, it was very important for us to address the present. So I'm actually going to start first with addressing the present with Rishi and then kind of go on to the other questions we had. Rishi, I wanted to start with the role of documentation, especially photographers and writers in these dire times, but also the precarity of teaching your students at this very dire moment. Could we start with that and then we could go on to the other questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Suchitra, Shuchi, everyone who's gathered here. And I'll just reflect upon the first part. Yes, I think documentation is extremely essential. And this I'm also saying from the perspective of being engaged with archives, especially the institutional archives at NID for last 7 years now. And what I'm discovering, and I don't think I can say that, we have a handle around the archives that we have at NIT yet, although we have been working on it for 5 years quite consistently. So what I'm discovering there is things that we don't find in the canonical historical accounts that we have of NID or of the people who were a part of NID, teachers, very well-known names, students. What we are discovering is the staff, the workshop staff, who were involved in helping students, create their textile patterns or, working in the wood workshop. Now, these are the things that I haven't come across in any, as I said earlier, in any canonical or any formal sort of articulation of the institution's history. Now, when we see that, it may or may not necessarily ring a bell in my head. So let's say if I'm looking at an archive of somebody working in textiles. In fact, one of my students has recently started working on the archives of Madhurima Patni, who was one of the founding members of textile design department at MIT. Now, as he started digging into it, my knowledge of textiles is very limited. But we are working in collaboration with our other faculty colleagues, and the kind of information that starts pouring out of it is extraordinary. Now, coming back to the need for documentation of what's happening, not just at state level, but day to day. I think it in the future carries the potential to reveal aspects of how people lived back then. What were their challenges? What were they dealing with? Because there are going to be some uh, accounts which will be more dominating, and that's how in the past also we have related to the history. We have only been able to, in so many cases, uh, formulate our understanding of phenomena in the world based on these very few and limited dominant voices. But if you're documenting, chances are that the multiplicity, the plurality of account itself can present a more wholesome picture of the times that we are going through at the moment for people in the future. And the future could be tomorrow, the future could be 10 years later. And then you've also asked me another loaded question of teaching at the
Yes.
moment. So do you really
Yes.
want me to answer it? It can be quite an answer, but I can attempt it. Well, yes. So last year, when NID declared holidays, so basically, as we understand, the pandemic started affecting people here in the country around mid-March, early March, mid-March last year. And I think around 16th of March or 17th of March, NID declared institutions shut, and students were asked to go back home for 2 weeks duration. And those 2 weeks, as we understand, like it's been more than a year now. But initially, the first week, I think I can easily say that I just rested and relaxed. I thought, I'd been working hard. But by the second week, I started realizing what's going to happen. But by the third week, I spoke to Amar, my colleague Amar, and we thought that maybe we should start engaging with the students in some way. Although there was no directive from NID till then, because NID took much longer to formulate the policy towards what we are today calling online learning and teaching. Actual decision from NID came around end of June, and we are still end of March, and that's the time. I can also give you a sense of when this happened around 17th of March. In the then ongoing semester, we had 6 weeks remaining. So usually a semester is an 18-week semester. So two-thirds was over, 6 weeks were remaining, and usually it so happens that most of the theory and skill-based courses are taken care of in the early and the middle part of the semester, and towards the end of the semester, students work on what we call design projects, which is essentially independent practice-based projects. So students of both the batches of the master's program, that is the first year and the second year at that stage, were in their design project stage with 6 weeks remaining. And usually it so happens that for the first year, the second semester design project, which is the design project 1, is a 6-week project where they are expected to work with communities, where they are expected to look outwards, make connections with what one may call other. And they had just started the project, or were in the process of starting. And our second year, we're already working on a 10-week project, and they had worked on 4 weeks. Now, all the access and everything came to a halt the moment the lockdown happened, and that is when I can say I think early April onwards we started engaging with the students just through emails and WhatsApp. At that time, we were not using Zoom platform. I was not even aware of that. And but then we created WhatsApp groups. We were sending out emails, and one of the things that we did at that stage was to make students look at what's in their immediate surroundings. What was accessible to them, in that state of very, very limited access outside their homes. And this became, and of course, we had been we've, we've been thinking about this for a long time, not in this situation or in this sort of context, but what one finds in one's immediate surroundings, what one may not care about, but it can be so important. So something like, family, something like grandparents, something like family albums, which are just around us. But we think that, to create a meaningful body of work, one has to go out and do all kinds of things. But this became the time when both the batches of students started engaging with things which were in their immediate surroundings. And I think I'm explaining it in such great detail so that everyone understands that till then we were not prepared for what we eventually ended up doing last, like more recently in this 1 year. I think now I can easily say that we have evolved our systems in many ways, but at that stage we had very little understanding. What I also did was, let me just find if I can do some screen sharing for you. I can continue to speak. So at that time, I think some students were struggling. They were trying to actually figure out, whether it is really meaningful or not, or is Rishi taking us for a ride? Because this doesn't look like a or sound like a really serious photo project. But I think one of the things which I cared about at that stage, which I didn't really discuss with the students as much, was the state in which everyone was. All of a sudden things had come to a halt. The future had all of a sudden become a lot more unpredictable. So there was a lot of skepticism, there was a lot of uncertainty, and I'm aware that a lot of young people as well as older people were falling into a very strange state of what, if I may call it, anxiety on one hand and depression on the other. So one of our approaches to engage students more than anything was to keep them occupied in some kind of meaningful engagement. So we were ourselves, that is I and Amar, had already discussed that we were not going to be very critical in our feedback, for those months, and we were also not aiming for some extraordinary produced final body of work. We are more interested in engaging the students on a daily basis or weekly basis to see. So we were also doing the reviews, but since we were not using the Zoom platform at that time, so we were expecting the students to share their work through Google Drive, and then we will share our feedback over email. And I think that slowly, as this duration of the break continued to increase, uh, and I think by the time NIT came up with what they call remote facilitation, it was already June. And by then, that is, our students had not just their core project idea, in some ways developed, but we also started working on what we were at that time calling additional quarantine exercises. So these were small exercises that somebody could do in 2 days or 3 days, or depending upon what they were doing, whether they were looking at what was happening in the parking lot outside, what was happening to the stray animals on the street, what had happened to the routine of their grandmother going to the temple every day. So people started looking at, and that itself is such potent to my mind, field. And I think the work that came out is quite extraordinary. And then we had a break and we started our next semester. And I think it is important to understand that, our journey, which is, by the time we started the next semester, it was already August, because in between we also had to do the admissions. And by then, we worked out the timetable in a certain way. And that is the moment when we adapted the curriculum in such a way that there was minimal immediate reliance on any physical infrastructure or resources at NIT. And fortunately, it happened to be the time for the first and the third semesters, wherein the requirement for access to physical infrastructure is comparatively lesser as compared to the second and the fourth semester. Now, of course, this was the time when I also experienced a bit of resentment in our second year students, who had just started the semester, and quite validly so, I must also add, because they were questioning the potential loss in carrying out the curriculum in a certain way. And they were also questioning the tuition fee, because, as you can understand, that at NIT, the kind of infrastructure that we have, so, a lot of resources that people put in. And there's also the back of the mind, they have this sense that they will be accessing some of the most sophisticated physical infrastructure, whether it is digital labs or the dark rooms, shooting halls, etc. So now they were saying that since we do not have that access, why should we pay that much fee? And I think that's quite valid. But we have to also understand the scheme. See, I'm just heading the department, but it is a central government institution. So there was this period, when there was a bit of unrest, but I think I can say that a lot of these things got addressed in a short duration of time. And I think one has to also keep this in mind that not every student had a proper access to a Wi-Fi connection or a data plan, because we have to understand that our students are coming from all nooks and corners of the country. So not everyone is coming from a metro area. So if we are beginning to run classes online, not everyone was able to participate as actively, as one would have expected to. So all these things were happening, and I also realized that many students coming to NID, uh, also coming to NID brings a certain sense of personal feelings. But the moment they go back home, and by August or September, they had already spent 5 months living at home after having spent time at NID. So which meant that they had to readjust back to their families, and at times, especially I've known that in some cases, some girls especially also had to contribute in household chores, or in some cases, boys had to help in family businesses. Now, how can you have the rigor of an online, like even if you're doing the semester online, and then you're also expected to do multiple things at home. So a lot of students wanted to come back to the hostels just to avoid that. So I think the frustration and fear caused by the pandemic and a forced distance from their friends and peers also combined this uncertainty of the future, created, and it really created a very disturbed emotional condition for many. And this obviously also, I mean, as I said, we were also going slow on our critical feedback. And but then by the end of the semester, which we ended in mid-January, the work which has come out is extraordinary. My understanding is that in near future, everyone will get an opportunity to see, what the students have done.
Rishi, I'm glad that you spent a lot of time kind of explaining this out. So this then becomes a good place to kind of go and interrogate multiple threads that we have. Um, I'm actually going to quickly jump into the teaching part of it more and then come back to the images coming out of India. Um, NID is considered one of the most haloed institutions in the country. It has produced some of the country's most, respected and well-regarded practitioners and artists. And yet, increasingly around India, many of these institutions, not just NID, some everything from St. Stephen's to JNU to IITs, the critique is that these institutions tend to be deeply elitist, often reproducing the same circles of elitism and privilege, and often can be a very unwelcoming and even a toxic place for those who do not perhaps come from those same backgrounds. You already mentioned these things of going back home, personal freedoms. Um, Talk to us about this. Talk to us about how accessible are institutions like NID, um, but also what are the things that you can see, how the students who perhaps do not come from the privilege of caste, class, access to socialization of elite, cultural power or privilege. Talk to us about those two.
So as I just mentioned, NID is a central government institution. And like any other institution in our country, it is unfortunately prone to the influence of the ruling government. Uh, I'll also add here that thanks to some of our bosses, our heads, that the extent of that undesirable intervention is still very limited compared to many others, but I can't deny it. Now, speaking of privilege, again, I'm taking you back into the history when the institution was set up. Most of the early board members, founders, political supporters, they were all business elites or, cultural czars, people like Gautam Sarabhai, Gira Bain, Pupul Jayakar, Indira Gandhi. So, that's how it started, in that seat of privilege. And I think it continued for some time, but, and I think there still is a certain air of exclusivity, which is primarily based on economic and cultural factors. But I must also acknowledge that most of these individuals, like in board members, etc., especially the early ones, they were also deeply committed to the Nehruvian way of post-independent nation building. And several models of grants, supports, training programs were instituted by them, and many of them still continue. And to my mind, many of these plans and programs and bursaries have made access fairly inclusive, for students. So NIT till date continues to offer multiple free ships, scholarships, need-based grants, as well as reservation for underrepresented communities of the students. That being said, I think I must also further add that when the students are coming, for the first time, immediately after the admissions, whether it is for undergrad or postgraduate, see, NIT is a melting pot of people, of communities. So people are coming from all over the country, And in the last 8 years I've been here, I think it has been such a great experience for me because I have been able to meet people from all over the country. And I think for many, this becomes the time when they see how the other people, what could be the other people of the same age group. Let's say somebody is coming from a rural area, and then we also have somebody coming from a metropolitan area. So the kind of exposure between the two could be very different. The kind of privileges could be very different. So obviously, initially, there can be a bit of, that space where, people could think that, oh, this is also how people live. And sometimes, it also leads to certain complexes amongst young people. Sometimes they, what we call, this wannabe syndrome. That people think that, okay, if you could carry yourself in a certain way or dress up in a certain way, you'll be more accepted in the society. So that does happen, but it happens for a very, very brief moment, because the moment the classes begin, the moment students start engaging in their exercises, etc., a certain level of critical thinking also starts playing. They also start speaking to their seniors, their peers, teachers, and I think over a period of time, this kind of neutralizes. But I can't say that it necessarily disappears.
I want to come to the question of pedagogy. Pedagogy for me is political. What you teach will have effects not only for their immediate design projects, but as they go into the world, create other things. I'm really curious to hear about how you see knowledge production and creation happening, not only as an educator, but also as you're also a photographer, you're an artist, you have a role in creating how knowledge is produced. Um, do you see a need for shifting away perhaps from some of the things that we do right now? So talk to us in general about those questions. I know we spoke about this very briefly before, but I would love to hear about your thoughts about teaching, knowledge production, but also ways in which perhaps we have to critically leave perhaps what might not be working now.
Okay. It could be a slightly extended answer. I'll try to keep it brief. Uh, I think I'll start by saying it is a very, very important component of our pedagogical framework. And I'll first start by reflecting upon what is critical thinking or critical theory. So critical theory basically is an approach to social philosophy that focuses on reflective assessment and critique of society and culture in order to reveal and challenge power structures. So with origins in sociology and literary criticism, it argues that social problems are influenced and created more by societal structures and cultural assumptions than by individual and psychological factors. So I think there's a lot of text that goes, for example, our students are expected to read Walter Benjamin, from Frankfurt School. And as we understand that, Benjamin and Horkheimer, they had described the theory of, this critical theory as insofar to, it is capable of liberating the human beings, from the circumstances that enslaved it. And I think these texts somewhere, I think I must also add that sometimes students think that, hey, we are here for photography. Why should we be reading so much text? But I think very, very soon, most of them realize that, how important it is, because that's also the time when they start realizing the difference between, let's say, a training program and education. See, photography training, I don't think one needs to spend 2.5, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years for photography training. I think now, especially, as we're speaking about the context of today, there are millions of online tutorials on how to operate a DSLR or a mirrorless or whatnot, or how to, figure out your aperture, shutter speed, etc. You don't need to be spending so much time and resources, to learn that. But I think the actual education is, this is when things start, because that is when people actually start doubting what is going on, why, and I think it slowly starts making sense to them. And coming back to the pedagogy and how critical theory and pedagogy are connected, I'll call it critical pedagogy. And critical pedagogy is basically, as I think you understand, philosophy of education, which is again deeply rooted in social movements, and something that applied concepts from critical theory, as well as certain traditions from the field of education. And I'll just also read out a quote for that, which is by Joe and Shirley Steinberg in their book, Changing Multiculturalism. And they say that critical pedagogy is the term used to describe what emerges when critical theory encounters education. And it insists that issues of social justice and democracy are not distinct from acts of teaching and learning. So basically the goal of critical pedagogy is emancipation from oppression, and through an awakening of critical consciousness. And when achieved, this critical consciousness encourages individuals to affect change in the world through social critique, through political action, self-actualization, perhaps activism, dissent, and I think these aspects of critical pedagogy, my understanding based on my research, is that they grew in the USA post-Vietnam, in the late 60s and the 70s, when people were questioning what's happening. And as it grew, it also started incorporating elements from fields like human rights movement, civil rights movement, disability rights movement, indigenous rights movement, postmodern theory, feminist theory, post-colonial theory, and queer theory. Now, speaking of the shift due to the pandemic, my understanding is that it's going to be quite epochal. It's going to be a very, very major shift, because it's going to change, as per my understanding, the role that institutions play, or the way we understand the role of institutions to play. Because my understanding is that, or somehow I foresee that there will be a certain dissolution of the institutions in the future, including the academic ones, and or let's say their roles will change, and probably the student, or if I may call them a seeker, the seeker or the student will have more freedom to design their education as they or their peers would choose to receive. And instead of subscribing or committing to a singular institution over a fixed period of time, my understanding is that individuals will be able to choose from and plan their education or educational experience across multiple domains and across multiple institutions. Now, this is not going to happen tomorrow, but my understanding is based on my last year's experience of how we are offering classes, how students are engaging with it, what have been some really extraordinary takeaways from that. I can also talk a bit about that. So, for example, let's say in a class, an instructor wants to show a book, and they have one book, and they bring it to the class. But at a time, they can only show it to the people who are sitting in the front. People at the back may not be able to see it unless they pass the book. But if there is a screen sharing in one go, so what we've done is we've also shared a whole lot of references, book-based references. We've got them scanned, and we've shared them with the students over Google Drive. And now these references stay with them all throughout, and not just in the in that moment when they were in the classroom, but they can access it at any time. Let's say if somebody is functioning at 2 a.m., they can still access their Google Drive and see the entire book wherever they are, right? And also the engagement. I mean, what we have realized is, yes, I think sometimes some people are a bit shy or they find it a bit awkward to show the surroundings that they are in. And as much as we want that they keep their videos on, sometimes they don't. But what I've realized is that in some cases, uh, the engagement within the groups has also increased in some way, or at least a more objectivity has set in. So I think these are some of the things that we are observing. But this is my take, that the role of the institution, the way we understand today, is going to change tremendously in time to come.
Rishi, I think this is a wonderful time to kind of go into the student works itself. Um, I want to come back to the question of students. Also, students really kind of have a more robust discussion about privilege, challenges, the digital divide, right? Not everybody had the data to have access. But also, there's something else that you told me that I still remember is you were saying how you now had students coming in from other backgrounds, mostly Bahujan backgrounds, Dalit Bahujan backgrounds, who are now coming and challenging your own view of looking at certain things. They're producing work that's asking critical questions. Um, Talk to us about your student works, the ways in which pedagogy is both ways, right? Pedagogy is the teacher is also taught by the student. Talk to us about things that you've learned from your students, but also we can also now use this time to look at some of the students' work you did, and also, as I said, the little magazine. I like calling the little magazine with great ideas that the students put together. This in magazine. Maybe it'll be a good time to do that.
Okay, so yeah, I just do my screen sharing and play some these videos that show the work. Uh, but I'll just begin responding to your point about the privileges and the challenges of the students. So I would say that uh, the current generation of the students, they are fairly exposed to multiple things. And I can say that, like if I compare myself, I got to know those things much later. They are already much smarter than what I was when I was their age. And I'm still learning. And I think I also sense emerging approaches in some of them to be, and some of them to be very conscientious already, very concerned, very empathetic, involved, etc. So which is very heartening. But I also think that somewhere they're running a bit low on patience and resilience. So one, I mean, one can also analyze how the economic liberalization of our country in the 90s, and of course, the advent of internet, uh, access to information has impacted these generational shifts. At the same time, I need not compare different generations or make any value judgments. For there is no end to coping that things have been so easy, have been made so easy for them compared to how they were for us. Uh, but I believe that the students have to recognize that education is not akin to subscribing to a service, or like using an app. It demands effort. It demands fearlessness, you know, especially when the future is so uncertain. And so we simply cannot rely on formulaic learning. The codes of the past, and if I may call it the pre-pandemic era, you know, not all codes are going to function the way we have known them. So I think it is extremely important that they respond to the challenges without fully trying to know what is going to be the final outcome. So because a lot of times, so let's say if you're going to work on a 10-week project, people want to know, what is going to be my final outcome. So what I'm saying is that more than that, I think it's extremely important that we engage with what's in our present moment, start working in different directions, explore. And, I must also say that they should not feel burdened by, this very uncertain future. They should not imagine that, these uncertainties of the future are actually happening in the present, because they're not now. Now is the time to explore. Now is the time, because whatever's said and done, academia still remains a fairly safe space, compared to being out there. So this is the time when, people can still explore, experiment, challenge their own notions, preconceived notions. And
She, I just have a quick follow-up question, just to clarify. Um, this anxiety of the future, right? Don't you think that also goes back to the sense of where students come from? For example, when I now go back to my early 20s, I could take certain risks because I knew that I was not responsible for taking care of my parents. My parents were financially and economically independent. I could take certain risks because I didn't have to go back and support someone. I, of course, also had the privilege of certain cultural things in which, I knew how to navigate certain things, um, but that might not be something that everybody is. Say if you are someone who comes, you're the first generation artist, you don't come from cultural, those anxieties are real, right? And I think so many careers have also been lost because I just kind of wanted to I agree with the things you're doing. I just kind of wanted to put that sense of hierarchies and access to resources also as a part of the conversation that we're having.
Yeah, sure. And I think traditionally speaking, in the non-Western world, we've always had these challenges and limitations of grants and resources. See, because let's say if you're studying to be an artist, you're not going to land up, with a placement to say so. Because most of the universities, they advertise that, okay, we've got these packages, even at NID, if you look at programs like industrial design, product design, automobile design, of course, students get placements. Doesn't happen with photographers. Now, what does that mean? And I think there is everyone knows this, right? It's not something, it's not a secret. So I think what we try to encourage students, especially in such scenarios, is to find some ways to, some peripheral means, to sustain their livelihoods or their lifestyles. And even, I can say that, and it, a photography education, especially, let's say, what we are offering, it's not just geared towards making someone, trigger happy photographer. One can write. One can be an editor, photo editor. One can be a critic. Something that we sorely lack in our country. We do not have photo critics. I mean, there are some, but not as many as one would imagine. So we encourage them, and see, also this is something which cannot be, there cannot be templates, because sometimes, somebody will say they have a language challenge. Obviously, they are going to find it more difficult, but then we try to help them, and they themselves, try and figure out what could be the thing that they could do on a regular basis or by the side to sustain themselves. And another thing that we've more recently seeing, the more recent trends last 1 year, 2 years, is that some of these grants have also started trickling down, like last 2, 3 years. So that is also a very, very welcome change. And continuing with, what I was saying about the students, I also would expect them, or encourage them to not rely too much on popular culture, or not seek validation from every Tom, Dick, and Harry, as they say, because and they also need to try and find better connection with their own selves, or what we may call be more comfortable in their own skin, as opposed to, let's say finding some Instagram post which has got 5,000 likes and trying to emulate that. You understand what I mean? And also, not everywhere, and students have to understand that not everywhere the education is formula based or formulaic, as we unfortunately observe in so many schools, other institutions in our country. And this basically means that they must engage mindfully. Can't hear
Should
you.
we see some of the student works?
Yeah, you want to do that?
Yeah,
Or
yeah, I would love
okay.
to. I
Okay,
really
all
want
right.
to. I want.
Okay,
I know this is exciting for
sure.
you, so I want. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Let me just do my screen share. So is it visible to you? I mean, what I'm sharing with you here is the, one of our publications, issue number 6, which is on an umbrella theme of resistance. And again, right now I'm not very keen to describe which work is which and what is what, but this is just to give you a glimpse of different approaches towards, let's say, a certain kind of articulation of uh, political critique, or critique of certain hierarchies, which exist, whether it is gender-based or caste-based, or imposed by the state. And I think here I'll also go back to one question which I didn't answer very well that you had asked initially about what I learned from the students. So when the students are coming from all these very, very varied backgrounds, I think that's when I start realizing what are the genuine or day-to-day challenges that they come from. See, because I was not exposed to that kind of life. I come from privilege. And I also, based on my education, feel very privileged. A lot of my education also took place in the West, especially photography education. So a lot of these things which are emerging out of the department is basically a collaboration between all the stakeholders, which could be the students, my other colleagues, as well as the visiting faculty, the guest faculty that we bring, and the students. So basically, the way I look at the department is a very advanced residency program, where everyone is a collaborator and the traffic is not one way. So it's more of a discourse, where people discuss ideas, where we encourage people to talk about issues that bother them, to also look into their own vulnerabilities, to acknowledge their vulnerabilities and start from that point. So it becomes a great experience, I think, for anybody who's mindful, whether they are a student or a faculty. And I think it leaves an impact, which I don't know. I mean, I think some of my recent graduates or those who graduated in 15, some of them might be going through that, and I sometimes think that today, like in 2021, I sometimes still remember things that, I'd learned from my students in 2015 or 13, and how relevant some of those things are. I'll just stop this. Shall we proceed with more questions that you may have, or you want to see more
Yes.
work?
I still have quite a few questions. I know we are close to the 1 hour mark. So I'm going to try and get to the questions. One of the other things that on the notes that you shared was the question of values. You talk about values. I'm curious to learn more about these values that you talk about, but also how does one, because values are also a response to the society, right? It's also certain ways in which one responds as an artist, as a photographer, as a thinker, as someone who documents. So talk to us about the values, the concept of values that you've been thinking about, and what that means.
See, the dictionary definition of value is the regard that something is held to deserve, the importance, the worth, usefulness of something. Or it could also be the principles or standards of behavior, or it could also
Rishi,
be
we
one.
can't see you. We only have the thing up.
Okay, sorry, so sorry. There you go. That's what I keep telling my students, who shut off their videos. Can't see you. Thanks. So I think these are also principles, of behavior, or one's personal judgment of, let's say, what's important for them in life. Is their value, or it's valuable for them. And these values can be defined by an individual. They can be defined by a group of people. It can be defined by communities. It could be defined by the nation also. And I think values also refer to the attributes of a certain mental, emotional, or physical discipline, that one carries forth for continued stability and for improvement of life's standards in the future. So, you stick to that set of discipline, and that is your value. You're sticking to your values because you want to really change something, you want to improve something. And I think that's my take on the values. But I think somewhere we can also connect it to what would be the morals, or and then because I see that a lot of times we'll get confused between what are values, what are morals, and what are ethics, right? So I would say that morals are basically personal standards of behavior. What is right, what is wrong, and I tend to believe that it can be fairly subjective, you know, uh, because I don't think that one can have a code, a universal code for morality or some of these morals. But in ethics, that's where it shifts, because in ethics, again, to my mind, is more universal than moral. So it is a set, to my mind, it is a set of codes or principles that govern a group's behavior, or let's say conduct of a group, conduct of an activity. So something that is governing it, you know, without necessarily it being law, without it necessarily being rule, is ethics. So it is that code of governance in a certain appropriate way, you know. And I would say anywhere one is doing anything which may influence or impact an individual or a group of people, it is paramount that it passes through that filter. It passes through that filter of ethic check, especially if it is going to impact a large number of people. So especially, and speaking of photography, I would say if it is meant for circulation, let's say if you're doing it for yourself, do anything, and one can certainly have that artistic license to represent things in a certain way. But one should be aware, what is the intent behind that? What is the purpose behind that? If you're going to use it for mass circulation, I think it becomes essential that you become sensitized towards who are the audience and how are they going to respond to them. So that becomes important. And photography, I think, unfortunately, has remained a problem child since ever. Since ever. And one can quote me also. I don't know how many audience we have today, but photography is riddled. It's riddled with many problems. List is endless. So to name a few, lack of consent. You're on street, something is happening, and you're in this decisive moment mode, right? You're the Bresson of the whatever 21st century, and you're not asking people because you are more interested in that decisive moment. So I'm just illustrating that. I'm not saying that there is anything wrong with the decisive moment. One has to understand that it has its own character, beauty. But what I'm saying is that since many a times, especially when we are photographing on street, we don't ask people, right? We don't take their permissions. We don't even say hello. I mean, I've seen that, you're a photographer with your camera and you're just going on that. You don't even engage. And that is what I mean by consent or lack of consent. And then voyeurism, that's another problem that photography has. Objectification, exploitation, a certain sanctimony. Misrepresentation is another problem that photography does all the time. Falsification. And I would say one of the greatest problems that I'm sort of thinking about is the perceived connection to any kind of truth. Because the connection that photography has had, especially in the 20th century, especially with the circulation of newspapers, where people became used to seeing photograph as the evidence of something that was committed somewhere. And I think people tend to, I mean, of course, everyone knows that, we are living in the world of fakeness, right? There are fake images all around us, but we still believe in it. And many times, a lot of photographers traffic images without even acknowledging, that they have changed certain aspects. So as I said, it's riddled with problems. But please mind well that I'm not proposing another doctrine, because as I said, everyone has a right to perceive, think, and function as they like. But bringing critical inquiry into your perception, bringing critical inquiry into your thinking and action, will go a long way in serving people in society.
But that also means that often you see um, very senior respected figures in the photography industry often doing these very same acts. And as a young person watching this, also is a form you then learn saying that these behaviors are okay. You think about perhaps this kind of behavior is okay. This kind of goes back to your Instagram thing where you say don't be taken in by what is getting attention, be comfortable with what you produce. That kind of brings us to the question of dignity and respect, right? um, can we think about questions of dignity and respect within the context of photography? And I just want to make a small comment is that in my book Midnight Spotters, there's a photographer Bhavan Singh is no more, and there's a small paragraph where I have a conversation with him about photographing one of India's. He was one of the few people photographed the massacre in Assam, and he says, sometimes photographers shoot, they also act in very predatory ways. And then he says, I have great love for this country, but I'm very afraid of where we are going in terms of how people are represented. Like, I mean, he doesn't talk about representation in open words, but he really talks about not giving the common man the dignity that he requires, or treat him with a certain sense of dignity that you want to be treated with. And I felt that that kind of fit in with yours thinking about dignity. Talk to us about this idea of dignity within representation, but also how that translates into photography, because it's kind of hard to think about dignity when you're on the street, not asking consent, shooting.
So can I give you a slightly expanded answer? I know that, we are almost, it's the end. See, first of all, as I tend to do, how do we understand what is dignity? What is the dictionary meaning? What is the etymology of dignity? It is a state of quality of being worthy of honor, or respect. Being worthy of respect is dignity. And dignity is the right of a person to be valued, to be respected for who they are and be treated ethically. And that is dignity. So, and I'll also make a small quote here. And according to Polis Kaufman and Hans Koch, in their book, Humiliation, Degradation, and Dehumanization, Human Dignity Violated, they say that human dignity can be violated in multiple ways. And according to them, the main categories of violation are humiliation, instrumentalization or objectification, degradation, and dehumanization. I'll very briefly touch upon, for the sake of our audience's understanding, what that is, what is humiliation? Because if you understand these four factors, you will immediately realize, especially if you're a photographer or if you're a photography student, you will immediately realize what we do all the time, and what can sometimes be crossing that line where we are beginning to impinge on somebody's dignity. And so humiliation, they say, basically is the violation of human dignity in terms of let's say any sort of diminishing of self-worth of a person or a group. And see, the acts of humiliation are context dependent, and normally we do have an intuitive understanding of when that violation is happening. And but most generally, or more universally, uh, it is some sort of downward spiral, in spatial orientation. That, and again, in terms of, let's say, visual hierarchy, that you're downgrading somebody or looking down on somebody, and you're humiliating somebody. So there is that sense of space and the downward positioning in that space. And then objectification. This is an aspect that where you treat a person as an instrument to achieve something. I would say what we see in advertising all the time is a whole lot of objectification of human body. I mean, we don't even realize that, but the moment you bring critical inquiry, critical thinking, critical theory, chances are that you will at least start observing that, oh, this is what is happening. You're objectifying a human body. And I think that is taking that bodies or that entire group which that body is representing, their dignity. And then third point is degradation, which is basically violation of human dignity by, let's say there are acts which are done by consent, like conveying a message, uh, that diminishes the importance or value of all human beings. Let's say something like propaganda, political propaganda, or let's say caste-based propaganda, where you are degrading an entire community by means of, let's say, communication or by means of propaganda. And they consist of practices and acts that modern society generally considers unacceptable for human beings, regardless of whether subjective humiliation is involved, such as selling oneself to slavery, or when a state authority deliberately puts prisoners in very inhumane conditions. And the last point is dehumanization, which is basically to strip a person or a group of people of their human characteristics. This may involve treating them as non-humans. So especially in history, we have seen so many acts of genocides. So that is, but we also see many genocides which do not, get acknowledged as genocides. We see that happening in our country as well. So this is what really is taking somebody's dignity away. If you're engaging in any of these acts knowingly or unknowingly, by virtue of action or intent, that's taking somebody's dignity away. And the thing is uh, that in photography, like when you show somebody, I think if you are genuinely compassionate, if you have a certain sense of other, which is not very different from your sense of yourself, or how you treat yourself, chances are that you will naturally be kind, and generous. But if you're not, uh, chances are that you'll be informed by your preconceived notions, your conditioning that you will be carrying since childhood. And as you understand that our communities are so divisive, and some of these things play. And I think either you go through some sort of experience in critical thinking and critical theory, or as what we call education, or you are genuinely, very, very aware person. And that's when, you can really do justice to representing people or communities with great dignity.
Suchi, do we have time for one more question, or should we open up for the Q&A, audience Q&A?
Yes, please go on. Go on.
Okay.
We start with
Rishi, I have one last question for you, and then I'm also moving the first question kind of to the linking them about the current crisis. We live in a deeply violent, divisive, casteist, a very unequal, divided society. Um, some of them have become exasperated over the last few years, but the fundamental social and political inequality has always been there. This, of course, then also translates into the writing, the visual medium, who gets to document. Um, I really wanted to frame that within the context of the images coming out of India since last year. I was very disturbed by these images of these immigrant workers coming out of, a lot of them, again, it was photographing these bodies in a very specific way. Some of them didn't even have their names. They just became a kind of trauma porn. Yet we did not, I wondered, maybe there are some notable exceptions, there was no ethnography of the people of power who made the crisis possible. What we were rather doing were documenting and photographing. Not that it was not required, but after a point it became, putting the mic on every person who was walking a few thousand kilometers to go home and say, Lo, tell us about your story. I'm very conflicted about those images as it came out. So talk to us about that the sense of how we document a crisis. What has been your perception of the images and the works coming out? How are you thinking about this? And with that, we will close it up, and then we will take the audience questions.
My views are very similar to what you just said. And that's exactly something, that comes up when we are looking at students' work, especially in design project reviews, and how you represent a body, how you represent a community. I think if you are losing your own sense of what could be considered as being human, that human factor, if you're becoming so focused on your intent to do that story, to finish that story, to uh, post your images online or bring it, whatever has to be done. People are so focused on that they forget in that moment that they're actually dealing with the human being. You know, and this is again taking us back to what we were discussing in the degradation aspect, or like how one takes away the dignity. Those four factors. And here I'll also introduce the aspect of gaze. And perhaps in Lacanian's very psychoanalytic sort of description of what a gaze is. It is that anxious state of mind, when you become self-aware that you are being seen, you are being looked at. So, and that is also the moment of vulnerability. And here, in this scenario, where these images were created in a certain way, that sort of gaze was cast on all these individuals by the hyenas, these media hyenas, because they wanted to show things in a certain way. And I will not shy away from saying that, a lot of our own media in the country, I think, is also to a large extent influenced by the ruling class or the government. So very few, of course, there are, these star groups, I can think of the Characters, for example, the Wire, they're who are doing some really interesting work, but mostly they're not aware. In people, especially media people, photographers, journalists, they're just following the Aaj Tak model. Aapko kaisa lag raha hai? I mean, come on. And I think this psychological effect upon the person that the gaze cast, they lose their autonomy. It's also, they think that they are no longer as human as they were. Now, they themselves may realize it or not, but as individuals, as students, as people, as professionals, I think they are very, very aware of that. Now, these things do hugely impact how, one represents a crisis, a situation, or a set of community. I think for anybody who would want to rethink about it, I can refer a book. It's called Politics of Gaze, the Image Economy Online by Yasmin Ibrahim. So it's worth checking because it actually says that how in media or how on online media we are vying for attention. We are trying to bring that story, and we claim that we are so deeply interested in human condition, but are we, by showing what we are showing, that by asking the kind of questions that we are asking, if we are taking the human's dignity away by virtue of any of these four factors that I described, I don't think that we are doing our job well. Rather, we are compromising, that's it. And I think one should also look at, I'm reminded of Pari networks, for example, the kind of work that they are doing. I think that's something quite interesting.
Also,
And
Khabar Lahariya, the work that Khabar Lahariya does, because it's all
absolutely,
rural. It's
absolutely.
very different than, yeah.
See, also, I think I'll just end this by saying that I think somewhere we are also riddled by what I may call a post-colonial syndrome. Whatever said and done, the photography came to India from the West, and by the British officers, as we know. But quickly, the know-how spread amongst a few select Indian operators, native operators. But the creative choices, the mannerisms of depiction, of representation, the demeanor, associated values pretty much remained the same as were presented by the colonial gaze. So unfortunately, I think I'm not saying that it hasn't completely changed. I'm seeing a certain wave of change nowadays. And this is something that at least I can say that our students are fairly aware of. But these are some of the things which have trickled down. So we are still replicating some of the same models. And then I think popular culture somewhere also ends up impacting the way we think about this collective. So that's that.
Yeah.
If you want, I can play that one video for you for a few minutes, or we can take the questions.
Suchi, do we have time for the video and the questions?
Sure. I think there are just a couple of questions. So,
We can
yes,
take the
Yeah.
questions now also. So either ways.
it's okay. You could play the
Rishi,
video.
why don't you play the video and then we'll take the final questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as Rishi is setting up, I'll just quickly answer one
Yeah.
of the questions that is for me, which says the name of the photographer. So the photographer is Bhavan Singh, and he photographed the Nelly massacre. I spoke to him in 2018 because I also wanted to understand what it meant for him. Because I mean, in the chapter, I talk about how there are no monuments of this massacre, unlike, if you look at other places that have survived, and then how the community actually uses this image as a way to remember. Initially, they were magazine photographs or magazine cutouts, and later they became these images downloaded from the website that people share, store on their phones in order to kind of say, this is what happened to us. So I interviewed him, and Bhavan Singh passed away during COVID. I only found out much later. So the photographer's name is Bhavan Singh. So that question is done. So we have a question from Vasant, but when we can do it after the video.
So here I'm playing a video by one of our recent graduates, Joel Fernando, and I won't describe it in great detail. Just watch it for 5 minutes, 49 seconds.
हमारे देश में बंदरों का विकास कम अधिक मात्रा में हर कोई सोचता रहा है, लेकिन आज सिर्फ पोर्ट डेवलपमेंट से काम चलने वाला नहीं है। आज आवश्यक है पोर्ट लेड डेवलपमेंट, और पोर्ट लेड डेवलपमेंट के आधार पर हमारे पोर्ट के साथ मैक्सिमम इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर की कनेक्टिविटी हो, और इस काम के लिए हमारे देश के पूरे समुद्री तट को जोड़ने वाला एक सागरमाला प्रोजेक्ट हम आगे बढ़ा रहे हैं।
നീ അരിയും കുരലും ചങ്കും എല്ലാരുടെയും പൊന്മകനെ ചാറും ചെറവും മധുവല്ലേ പൊന്നച്ച നീ മൂന്തിയ മധു നിൻ ചോര ചുടുചോര പൊന്മകനെ നാം പൊത്തിയ പൊക്കാളിക്കര നാം പൊത്തിയ പൊക്കാളിക്കര എങ്ങേ പോയി നല്ലച്ച നീ
നീ വാരിയ ചുടുചോറൊപ്പം വെന്തേ പോയി നന്മകനേ. അക്കാണും മാമലയൊന്നും നമ്മുടതല്ലൻ മകനേ. ഇക്കായൽ കയവും കരയും ആരുടെയുമല്ലൻ മകനേ. പുലികൾ പക്കി പരുന്തുകൾ കടലാനകൾ കാട്ടുരുവങ്ങൾ പുലികൾ പക്കി പരുന്തുകൾ കടലാനകൾ കാട്ടുരുവങ്ങൾ പലകാല പരദൈവങ്ങൾ പുലയാടികൾ നമ്മളുമൊപ്പം നരകിച്ചു പൊറുക്കും ഇവിടം ഭൂലോകം തിരുമകനെ. കലഹിച്ചു മരിക്കും ഇവിടം ഇഹലോകം എൻ തിരുമകനെ.
So that was that.
Right.
We can.
So Rishi, we have questions. The first is from Vasant Nayak, and Vasant asks, can you respond to the idea that there will only be learning and no real teaching in the future, and teachers will just be facilitators already happening?
Well, thanks, Vasant, for being here in first place. And yes and no, I guess. So I think it's fairly. Can we see it also written somewhere on the chat box?
Can you see
Just
the
for my
Q&A?
reference.
For the Q&A, can you click on the Q&A? You can see the questions.
Perfect. Oh, yes and no. I think there is going to the role of the teaching, to my mind, is going to remain as universal as ever, or as timeless as ever. But the way we understand this may change. I think that, as you very rightly said, that facilitation is going to be a more important framework of what we understand as the role of the teacher. And also, I think somewhere it's about the connection that the teacher forms with the students. So it's not just functioning based on cause and effect or based on curriculum. It is based on, like, as I said, you collaborate, you work together towards something. So depending upon what the group is discussing, the teacher can always bring more experience. Teacher can always bring more understanding of the world. And I think that becomes an extremely important aspect of working in any, in any endeavor, in any group setting. So I think the role of teacher is going to remain intact, but the way it plays out will obviously change quite a bit, quite considerably. I hope I'm able to answer it all right. What do you think? What is your take, Suchitra?
My take, I believe that educational institutions, I think we are in a moment of great shift. So much is going to change. Um, as society, as our relationships with each other, there's a global climate change. It'll fundamentally remake so much. And along with it, I think institutions will also get remade. There's something that I've said before, and I would like to repeat it again now, is that we can either be a part of that change and actually lead the change in the direction that we want, or we then become quiet spectators in this. And if I would like to have it my way, I would actually go in a direction where knowledge, education becomes free and accessible to all. And it's already happening in so many ways. The moment knowledge is no longer only in the purview of a few, I think, and I think that the moments in which you saw that actually happening, that liberalization, the moment you opened up education, at least I can say this for the experiences of both the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy, even a little bit of democratization of education changed so much. And I think that'll happen. I think the forms is already changing. People are already reaching out. We have been doing these free classes and sessions where we do small groups of students. People are already responding. And I think some of the things that you earlier said about how you responded, you and Amarnath both responded, I think those are all an intuitive inclination of us responding to the change. And I think we should be also kind of be we should lead the change that we want. I know it's not easy, but I think we should kind of do that. We have another question from Manish Kumar who says, as a serious amateur photographer, it is tough to understand the learnings without having a guru or institution. How can one learn by themselves or get the opportunities? So that's another thing, that institutions also become a place to funnel opportunities. Say, for example, that is true of a lot of MFA programs, because MFA programs, I'm just giving as an example, that institutions also become, what happens if you are someone who's an autodidact, who doesn't say have the resources or doesn't, not everybody functions with an institution. I'm really curious what you're thinking about this.
Okay. Well, I think somewhere I'll connect it to what I said earlier, how I see my program, where I look at it as some kind of a residency program and not really a place, where I'm necessarily teaching anything. What is teaching? If you ask me, I may not have a straight answer for that. So what we do basically is we chit chat, we look at each other's work, we criticize also, we talk about all kinds of things. And I think that's what it is. It's not about knowing theory, by heart. It's not about knowing all the names by heart. It's about beginning to understand uh, our place, in the bigger scheme of things as photographers or as emerging photographers, or if you want to call it media professionals, and not just photographers. So, and again, it need not necessarily follow a uniform code. Different individuals, based on their different interests, their capabilities, can choose, what they want to work on, and then just go on slowly, uh, perhaps increasing the quotient of the challenge, or as we say, the difficulty level. In video games, there are these levels. So you just go on increasing that hardship level, and in order to build, one can, of course, a whole lot of resources today are available online, but I still cannot say that it can necessarily replace the kind of library that we have here, where one can physically go and see things, although we have started now digitizing as many things, as many books as we can. But I think for Manish, I would say that I think it's fantastic, that you are already acknowledging that you are deeply interested in something, photography, and you want to pursue it in a certain way. So I think that itself is a great start, because I think it starts with that acknowledgement, because only after you acknowledge it becomes a conviction. And I think if it becomes a conviction, chances are that even if you're not a part of institution, like you asking this question itself is a signifier of a minor courage that you have demonstrated. And I think That's very important. Courage is very important. So once you have an intent, once you have a conviction, and once you have the courage, right, you can, start figuring out, what is working out for you and what is not. And chances are that you may start off on a path, and after walking on it for some time, you realize that it's not working, and that's totally all right. That's fine. You know, you so you come back or you start something by the side. And as you are asking the question to me right now, and now fortunately, we have multiple such platforms in our country, like Chennai Photo Biennale is doing fantastic work. They are offering these workshops, they're offering panel discussions, exhibitions. So try to engage as much as possible with these opportunities that you see uh, in the country, as well as, since a lot of things are happening online. I think try to engage. Now, I'm not saying that you blindly accept everything that gets dished out. So remain logical, remain contextual, build on something, try to do a portfolio review. Let's say you work on something over a period of time. Then let's say if there is, my understanding is that Chennai Photo Biennale will be doing a physical festival later this year. So likewise, if there are opportunities to do portfolio reviews with established photographers or agencies, do that, and try to also meet educators, who could be, let's say, in some ways instrumental in helping you look out for residencies, uh, and you yourself will realize over a period of time how your work and your thinking evolves.
Yeah. Also, I think I'm an autodidact. I didn't go to institutions to learn. And one thing I would say is that every time I've reached out to someone whose work that I've liked, not now, even in the early in 2000s, when I didn't know anyone, I didn't have a photography community, but I genuinely looked at someone whose work that I liked, someone whose writings on photography that I liked, and I wrote to them. Folks who are good at what they do are always also teachers, and they've always been very generous in terms of their time, in terms of writing back with suggestions. It might take them a few days or time, because people tend to be very generous in terms, at least the ones whose work that I like. There's also a certain kind of, birds of the feather flock together. Every time I've reached out for resources, for help, for ideas, for suggestions, for critique, I would say at least 80% of the time, people have always been generous, because someone who's has all of these values, I often find are also generous with their time. Sometimes it's hard. I mean, it doesn't mean that everybody, you can't ask a photographer for a portfolio review for 2 hours. Everybody's busy, but they will definitely take the time out to help. And I think that's always been my experience. Because people have been generous to me, I then try and pass it on to others. But everybody whose work that I love, who I respect, also, some of the earliest conversations I started having about photography were with people like Ritesh Uttamchandani and Raj. I know Raj long before he became a photographer, when he was about to become a photographer. Even when he was learning to become a photographer, I was crowdsourcing cameras for a photo project. And he actually got all the cameras that he could find in his community and bought it to me. This was when he was trying to figure out how to become a photographer. He didn't have access to equipment, but I still remember the absolute generosity with which he went, grabbed all the cameras in his community or the people that he could, and he bought it to me. And he said, "Yes, Suchitra, these are things. Now let's go do something." I don't think we often enough talk about how truly wonderful and generous. There are a lot of some terrible people as well, but I think we should also celebrate those who are very generous. And I think that brings us to the end of these 4 phenomenal conversations. It started as Suchi saying, Suchi and Gayatri saying, "Hey, do you want to talk about your book?" And it became into conversations. I feel like I've gotten to reconnect with some friends, make new friendships, but also talk to some remarkable people whose work I've always loved and admired. Thank you, Suchi. Thank you so much. And Vasant, thank you for always making all of these things possible. Suchi, on to you.
Thank you, in fact, and Rishi and all our other speakers for making the time and for being with us. I think this is the one part about the work that we do that we love, is just having important conversations, having meaningful conversations, because there are many of us who are out there photographing, and some of us are doing really exceptional work, some really truly genuinely good people building communities. And I think that's what we are all about, that today if we are all here together at this hour, it is purely because we connect on these values and value systems. So I think that's great, and thank you so much. This conversation was great, and I hope there will be more conversations in the near future as well. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rishi, for sharing the student works and the beautiful video by Joel. I think that was also important for our audience to see. And Rishi, yes,
Well,
any closing remarks?
not closing remarks, actually, Suchitra knows that, I had prepared this big as presentation, PPT, PowerPoint presentation with 47 slides. But then,
I can
I
imagine
just,
that.
I just decided that, it's not really a lecture presentation, it's just a conversation.
Yes.
So we will find another opportunity for that. But thank you so much, Suchitra, for first of all asking me. Usually, I shy away from such let's say, experiences, also because, kind of work that I'm in the midst of at the moment. But here I felt, it's something which is what I do on daily basis. And also, two of you, I thought, I should do something. It's been a while. So overall, I think it worked out fantastic. Then I think, as we all felt, the ongoing moment that we are in at the moment, in context of what's happening in the country, I think we all had questions, whether to proceed with it as per the plan or not, what to do. But then I think I felt personally that some of the things that we are going to discuss today are going to be of at least some benefit to the students and professionals who could be doing this program today. And if they could be a bit more mindful of, how they function, maybe, we would succeed a tad bit, 0.1% in what we are wanting to do for a period of time. So thank you so much for inviting me in the first place. And thank you, Vasant, for the support.
Yes. Thank you all for being with us. Please be safe wherever you are, and we will stay connected with you. Do follow us on our social handles and subscribe to our newsletter. Actually, that's the best way that you won't miss out on any of these interesting conversations and other programs that we do. And we'll stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye bye.